Hey everyone, I'm Terrence and I'm one of the co-founders of Cartridge, and we're a Starknet gaming console, and I'm excited to talk to you about an idea called generational games. But first, just wanted to shout out to Kuno, who put a ton of effort into organizing this awesome event. Really appreciate it, and thank you guys for all attending. So yeah, generational games is kind of this idea of creating, like, how can we create games that can endure for very long periods of time and have properties more similar to the types of games that we see in the physical world, right? That like can really last like way beyond the duration of like the people that originally created it, things that you see, you know, like with soccer and things in the physical world. How can we kind of reproduce those kind of properties in digital games, and how blockchain technology, and particularly like Starknet, can enable this this kind of dynamic with on-chain blockchain games. So the canonical example that exists today, like kind of the longest running franchise in gaming, or at least one of them really up there, is obviously the Warcraft franchise, which is going on, you know, a little bit over 20 years now, and has been like instrumental in creating digital gaming ecosystem and spawning a bunch of different games, even games and different game types. So, you know, you had the original Warcraft series that was built on this, built up with this original lore of the orcs and the elves and whatnot, and was an RTS style game, and then it spawned like a mod of it, Dota, which spawned this whole like MOBA franchise, as well as World of Warcraft, which is like an online MMORPG, and just like this massive amount of innovation in the gaming ecosystem that happened on top of Warcraft. But you know, the Warcraft IP was owned by a traditional company. It had like very similar incentives to every other traditional company, which is like long-term is around value extraction, and that like incentive misalignment between like the people that actually cared about the game and participated in it and really loved it was like at odds with the objectives of the organization, like Blizzard, to build and protect its IP, and kind of over time, like the incentives for them, you know, to continuously iterate and extract value led kind of to the stagnation of the ecosystem, and ultimately to like the games evolving in a way that no longer resonated with the players that originally really loved it, right? And so today, if you went back into this franchise and you went and played the games today, they would look very different from what you originally remember when you first got involved in and started playing them. And in a lot of cases, the players or the items and the stuff that you had would no longer exist anymore, right? So it's a very different dynamic than, for example, if you play a game of poker today or you play a game of poker 20 years ago, it's still the same game, same, you know, kind of mechanics and everything that you used to remember. And so, yeah, like I mentioned, like the problem really stems from this value misalignment between like the organization that controls the IP, that wants to keep it as a permissioned ecosystem, wants to extract the value themselves. So for example, in the case of Dota, which is a mod on top of it, like spawned a whole massive new category of MOBAs, but Blizzard was actually hostile to this mod on top of Warcraft, and ended up like the Dota franchise and League of Legends were run by separate companies that actually got to capture that value. And if like the Warcraft lore itself had more similar properties to a blockchain, right? Like something like a permissionless foundation that anyone can build on top of, that have like data availability guarantees, that they're not going to be kind of like rugged by underlying IP holders or, you know, centralized server providers. These other games could be built like as sustainable businesses on top of like this foundation, and you could conceivably have like an ecosystem that still exists today and thrives today, all built on this like shared universe of the Warcraft lore. And so, you know, the talk really wants to talk, what I really want to talk about is how blockchains can enable this. I mean, we see a lot of these kind of properties today in blockchains themselves, right? Like you have a ton of different blockchains, which are really just an expression of the values of people. You have like Bitcoin, which is forked obviously like numerous times. It's a bit of Bitcoin Cash and stuff like that. But like they still maintain the ability for people to express their preferences, and to still, like, the way that a blockchain encodes information across time means that you can still, like, if like some decision was made, you can kind of rewind time. Like, for example, if you really loved like Ethereum when the DAO event happened, you could today spin up an Ethereum node, like kind of rewind it to the state and continue building on blocks, like no one probably would care about it. But if you like had a nostalgic like attachment to that moment in time, you could go back and do that, right? And I think like games have this like similar dynamic that has kind of been ruined, right? Like recently I spun up Pokemon Fire on like a Game Boy emulator and started playing it, and it's literally the exact same game as when I was playing it as a kid. Like I still remember like running around the map and, you know, had that very shared experience. But with games as like they've kind of evolved today, where it's subscription based, it's centralized servers, like they're continuously iterating and introducing new games, changing the rules underneath them, that entire dynamic is kind of out of the window, right? And I think that blockchains have a unique ability to kind of bring this dynamic back. And in order to do that, like you really need to take advantage of the permissionless nature and the ownership that is enabled by blockchains. And in order to do it on a blockchain at the kind of scale that's necessary for a gaming universe and for gaming mechanics, you need like kind of the scalability that's enabled by, for example, Starknet. So today we see, you know, like the early stages of this. We obviously have things like primitives or entities that have started to become on chain. These are like kind of the Web 2.5 games. You have some NFT that represents some item in a game or a character in a game, and some properties of it will live on chain. Like mostly it's just a digital representation that can take advantage of some like capabilities of the blockchain. Like for example, like trading or liquidity is really like the narrow value proposition, which I think is still quite interesting. But like the value of those assets themselves is still derived by like some, you know, centralized entity that probably still owns the IP, implementing some game that like utilizes it in some interesting way, and they could at any moment in time decide not to do that. So you still don't have this like kind of hardness that blockchains bring. You have like some new interesting properties over traditional games, but you're not taking advantage of the full capabilities. And yeah, so like for some examples of games that are doing this today, I mean, Loot is obviously the canonical example, which was started, you know, as a simple kind of card with a bunch of different items on it, and it spawned some more expressive like representations of it. Like you have adventures, there's renderings of it, and then as well as like the whole on-chain ecosystem around realms, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. And so yeah, the challenge with this is just what I mentioned, like the fact that these assets are still coupled to like some centralized entity, like giving them value through like the implementation of a game, means that they're really not like blockchain assets in the sense of like Ethereum or Bitcoin, where, you know, those assets exist in this like kind of like fully on chain by themselves in isolation, and they create their own value. They're not like dependent on like some off chain like out of band function that's necessary to imbue them with value. And then the assets themselves are static, right? Like the way that the original NFT, like ERC 721 specifications were written, a lot of the attributes, for example, of an asset aren't legible on chain. So, you know, a lot of NFTs will just link to an IPFS URL or an AWS or something like that. It'll give you a JSON blob, and you can't really read that value from another smart contract, right? Like if you wanted to have a game that interoperates or like is able to read the attributes of an NFT on chain, that NFT would have to like implement API endpoints that are outside of the specification to make that possible. And so like the current like primitives that we see a lot of are really not well tailored towards this. But we're starting to move in that direction, and particularly in the Starknet ecosystem, and as well as in some of the EVM on-chain games, a lot of the games are experimenting with bringing some of these attributes on-chain, right? So not just like the digital representation of the asset itself, but what are the properties of it? Like if you were playing World of Warcraft, you know, you have an item, and that item has a bunch of different properties. It has, you know, like attack speed, or, you know, a level, or agility, stamina, some special abilities that could potentially change over time. And those are obviously very important to like the properties of the item itself. And we're starting to see this like in realms, for example, with they have realms on chain that have a bunch of different attributes around like what are the properties of the different realms, and these properties and the attributes actually impact the rules of the game and can influence basically the mechanics of, you know, how much of a civilization you can build on them, or what types of civilizations you can build on them, and then ultimately like your chances of winning the game. And so the cool thing about like once you start to put these attributes on chain is those attributes are like legible to other smart contracts. So anyone can start building on top of them, and you can start building like interesting dynamics. You can start building like new mods on top of it, like new games that consume these assets underneath and are informed by these like canonical representations of like an item and its attributes, and interpret them in different ways. And then similar to the Warcraft ecosystem, you can build like new genres of games, but like what's different is you can build like sustainable business models on top of it, of games that aren't like subject to the underlying like IP holders like kind of suing you if you become too successful. So you basically have this like permanence guarantee, or this like data availability guarantee, that you can always access these attributes inside of your application. The next step is like this third level, which is behaviors, which again we're starting to see in the Starknet ecosystem, of the actual implementation of like physics engines, or the interactions between the different assets in the game. So like rules that control, like for example, crafting, like how many like wood and does it take to start a fire, for example. And there's a few different examples of this, like one by the topology team called Isaac, and they've done a bunch of interesting stuff around physics simulations on chain. There's something we built for the Dope Wars ecosystem called Roll Your Own, which is a fully on-chain recreation of the classic game called Drug Wars or Dope Wars, which is an arbitrage game. There's the Realms universe that's building a bunch of different games like based on these assets that exist on chain, and a few others influence Iker, all doing like really interesting things, all on top of Starknet. And so like once you have these three different things, you have like the entities, like the attributes of them, and then the behaviors that governs the interactions between them. You can start building these emergent universes, right? Like the interaction between these and the rules can start to define like these in parallel universes of, maybe with this value for gravity, or these different new items or resources that can be used for different things. And you can start to build out like these foundational like parallel universes that can govern like different game and the lore around them, in a shared way that can be owned by the gamers and governed by the gamers. And these properties will like inherit the hardness of the blockchains underneath them, and can exist for like long periods of time without necessarily needing someone to run a shared server or something. So in the future, like let's say you built a game today and people played it for 10 years and then people kind of lost interest. Another 10 years from now, someone could very easily just download your client off GitHub, run it, and just respawn like this world, right? And people can continue to collaborate in it, and it kind of doesn't just disappear. And yeah, so I mean, we're starting to see a lot of these kind of things come to life now on the Starknet ecosystem. I think Realms is one of the teams obviously pioneering this, in topology as well, where you can start to play around with like fully on-chain games that take advantage of all these different properties. The last like interesting component of it is like once you have these like worlds, there's a question of governance, right? It's like there's two different ways that you can expand these universes over time. There's like some canonical set of attributes or entities and items that like everyone will interpret in a similar way and have some quantity like associated with them, like energy or something. And you maybe want like player bases to come to some consensus to change those attribute properties, which obviously happens a lot in traditional games around balancing things. And you want to enable something like that similar in the game through like player participation, right? So instead of in the traditional world where these decisions kind of come from the top down and lack, in a lot of cases, legitimacy, you can create dynamics with on-chain games where they come from the players themselves, right? So like if most of the players agree, like this item is too strong, then they can kind of like come together and make a decision to nerf it in a way. And that decision to nerf it, like obviously will upset some people, but it has a lot of legitimacy coming from the player base itself, rather than like just like, the game studio from up top, because their incentives are very similarly aligned in the success of the game or the propagation of the universe. And so yeah, I think like these kind of properties enables like a lot of like an interesting new type of this almost like emergent organism that can start to like live on chain and tell the stories of that will power the future game universes and be owned by the players. And I think like opening up that level of interaction to players and ownership by players can create like a very strong emotional attachment by people, where they really feel like involvement in, you know, the creation of these games, and I think is going to be an incredibly important dynamic in the future of games. One interesting example that the topology team has actually been working on is car style, which is like a values-aligned way of, or incentive-aligned way of enabling players that contribute to a game or play a game to contribute to the governance of the game and its evolution over time. And they've done some interesting work there. So what's stopping us from doing all this today? Mostly what's stopping us is the scalability of blockchains, and that's why we're all here, is for the capabilities that Starknet and Validity rollups enable. And so, you know, if you look today, like you kind of have Starknet, you have a bunch of different players interact with Starknet, and Starknet can aggregate transactions, and then and kind of you can outsource the compute to Starknet, and because it's done verifiably with ZK proofs, you can scale that up to, you know, like a centralized producer that has a very big machine, can dramatically increase the transaction throughput of the blockchain, and then checkpoint that to Ethereum and inherit like the properties of the Ethereum blockchain, and that information will exist forever, or as long as Ethereum is around. The next like interesting step, I think that we'll see once, you know, Starknet starts to mature over the next couple of years, is the evolution of gaming specific rollups. So ZK rollups enable something called fractal scaling, and that's enabled by ZK proofs. And basically that means that you can have like a gaming specific rollup that can, you know, can run the computation for a specific like kind of like universe or simulation, and then checkpoint that to Starknet, which then rolls up itself into Ethereum. And using this kind of pattern, you can like massively expand the amounts of compute that's available for games, and that you can start to bring on chain and have these properties that like the base layer of Ethereum enables. The next piece of the puzzle is obviously data availability. So data availability is like the ability to store like all the information that is necessary to execute the logic on chain, right? And to do it in a way that it like has certain guarantees that will be available to the execution layer over time. Starknet, like through the use of ZKs, also enables some interesting dynamics here, where you can have like kind of a spectrum of data availability solutions that you can choose from. You can have, you know, the most secure version would be to checkpoint your data directly onto the Ethereum base chain, and then you can have things like data availability committees, and you can choose based on, you know, the properties that the assets in a game require, like where you want to store that information, which is, I think, is going to be an incredibly important dynamic that's enabled again through ZK, Starks, and Starknet. So yeah, I think generational games are going to be incredibly interesting. Like the creation of like these public good universes that, you know, anyone can contribute, like with APIs that are permissionless and have good guarantees that they're not going to change over time, that you can build, you know, higher levels of abstraction on top of without having to worry about the foundation below you getting changed, and that can evolve over time through the participation of the players that are most attached to that universe. And I think like we'll see, you know, probably in the next few years, like a lot of different interesting experiments on trying to bring these types of experiences to market. And I really think that someone, when they get the foundations right, is going to build something incredibly powerful. And we already see that today, even with early iterations of this through like, you know, Loot and Realms and, you know, Dopewar's ecosystem and stuff like that. So at Cartridge, we're working to basically enable this future, and so we're doing what we can to facilitate the creation of the on-chain gaming ecosystem. We have two products. One is the Cartridge Arcade and the Cartridge Controller, and you can check them out at cartridge.gg. We're very focused on onboarding players into the game, so we're partnered with a lot of different games in the Starknet ecosystem, and we're working on a few different innovations on how to basically allow players to start playing games without having to go through, you know, the process of seed phrases and all this kind of stuff. just a single click and start playing a game, and helping them discover different games and different mods built on top of them, and building incentive structures inside of them to help with player engagement, especially in the early experimental phases of iterating and building out these games. Cool, that's Cartridge. Thank you. Yeah, if we got some time, if anyone has any questions, happy to answer. Or is there any questions? I think we're good. Okay. Oh. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would say like the APIs for like interacting with the blockchain are pretty well defined. So the cartridge controller is really like a wallet that's specialized for games. And so it implements the same interface as like a typical wallet. So, you know, if Starknet has, you know, like an interface that they've defined of what an account should implement, like the execute function, for example. And the cartridge controller implements that same interface. So from a developer perspective, it's very easy to use. And from a player perspective, you know, like things that we're pushing on is things like session keys and user authentication and portability across devices, and the ability to like use your account. For example, we implement something called WebAuthn that allows you to use like a secure enclave to manage your credentials. So that's kind of the stuff that we're focused on. Like from a developer perspective, I would say the API interface is very similar.